Okay, let's move to the roundtable session. And I will first introduce the panelists. And our first panelist is Professor Jean-Pascal van Ypersele. Is a Belgian academic climatologist, and he's a professor of environmental sciences. And at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, he served as the vice chair of the IPCC during 2008 and 2015. He is a leading advocate on climate change mitigation through strong decreases of fossil fuel consumption. He did his doctoral research on climate modeling at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the United States. He has published with the natural and social scientists about climate change and sustainable development at both global and regional scales. He has been extensively involved in the IPCC since 1995. And as a lead author, review author, and bureau member, and IPCC vice chair, he has he has participated in most UN conferences on climate issues since 1979 and was instrumental in creating in 2002 the UN Work Program on Climate Communication and Education. He holds numerous awards in science and science communication. He has been appointed by the UN Secretary General member of the group of scientists in charge of the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report. He serves as an advisor to the Belgian delegation at the UN COP26 in Glasgow. And then the second panelist is Professor Fu Jun, and is a professor of political economy and public policy, and currently serves as the academic dean of the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. He is the first Chinese to have been elected as the foreign academician of the Bologna Academy of Sciences, Italy, in its long history. Previously, he held faculty positions at the School of Economics and Management, School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University, and also School of Government at Peking University. Outside academia, he has served as a member of the listing committee of Shenzhen Stock Exchange, vice chair of Global Agenda Council on new growth models of the World Economic Forum, and advisor to chairman of the Executive Council of UNESCO, appointed by the governing board. He has also served on the 11-member visiting committee for area and international programs at Harvard University. A global thought leader, he was twice featured in the Outlook on the Global Agenda, Davos annual flagship publication. Professor Fu Jun has co-authored and edited 5 books, most recently including Pathways to Prosperity in Meta-Heuristics Growth Theory, a China Narrative in Chinese, Peking University Press 2021, and the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation in China, Policy, Technology, and Market in English, published by Springer Nature. And also, he is the president emeritus of Harvard Club of Beijing. He received his PhD from Harvard University and has been an invited reviewer for the PNAS, and the Journal of PNAS, and serves on the advisory board of Economia Politica, Journal of Analytical and Institutional Economics. The third panelist is Dr. Ma Jun. He is a chairman of Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, also the co-chair of G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, and the president of Institute of Finance and Sustainability, co-director Micro and Green Finance Lab at the National School of Development at Peking University. He was the former chief economist of the People's Bank of China and a member of Monetary Policy Committee. Dr. Ma also worked as a chief economist of the Greater China region and the German Bank, a senior economist for the World Bank and economist for the IMF. He holds a MA from Fudan University and a PhD in economics from Georgetown University. And finally, let me introduce the chair. Dr. Liu Zhi is a senior fellow and director, China and Asian Program, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and also the director, Peking University Lincoln Institute Center for Urban Development and Land Policy. He is specialized in land and housing policy, urban and environment, and infrastructure finance, and urban and regional planning. He serves as a member of expert committees for housing and real estate, and for human settlements, Ministry of Housing and Urban and Rural Development China. Previously, he was a lead infrastructure specialist at the World Bank with years of operational experience in the infrastructure and the urban sectors. He co-edited International Housing Market Experience and Implications for China, and Infrastructure Economics and the Policy International Perspective, published by Lincoln Institute of Land Policy 2021. He received his PhD from Harvard University. Now let's welcome the chair to chair this roundtable. Dr. Liu Zhi, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Professor He, for your introduction. And now let me take over to chair the roundtable section. And I'm pleased that Professor Mike Spence is still with us. I hope he can jump in to join our discussion as well. And now let me, before Mike, since Mike is still here, and let me first ask him a question before we start the panel discussion. Is that okay, Mike? All right.
I'm here.
Yeah. Well, I used to work for the World Bank before, so I know that you produced a very influential report for the World Bank, and in year 2009 about the economic growth and climate change. And now it's 12 years past. And do you have new insight about the relationship between economic growth and climate change, particularly the current global climate actions, and how, what are the major tensions between economic growth in many developing countries and climate actions that we very much focus on now?
So when I look back at what we were trying to think about, I guess it was pretty clear that even then, although there wasn't a kind of global consensus around this, that climate was a potential major disruptor of growth and development. So in some sense that hasn't changed. But what we did notice at that time was, what I would call widespread dysfunctional policies. Things like energy subsidies were ubiquitous, and to some extent still are. One of the things that the commission I was a member of said with Montek and Governor Zhou Xiaochuan was, we have to get rid of these policies. That they're gonna get worse. They're bad now. They're going to get worse as the climate agenda starts to sort of come to a head. And I think that was right. One question, that came up at the time was, do you grow first and then deal with the environment later? And I think the consensus that's emerging now is that that's not the correct strategy. that you need a balanced approach to sort of growing on the one hand and paying attention to the environment, one element of which is, you know, one's role in climate change. Having said that, you know, I think this notion of sort of everybody has responsibilities, but they're differentiated is right. I mean, I don't think that you know, the policies that Norway adopts with the resources it has available to it should be applied to a low-income country. So I think, you know, from that period and right to today, the challenge remains, you know, how do we all participate in this with the appropriate differentiated responsibilities that are consistent with our state of development and the resources that are available to us, depending on where we live.
Thank you very much. And I think we will get to more interesting questions to discuss. And now our panelists are here. And I will first regret to inform the audiences that Professor Philip Mendiger of Cambridge University is unable to join us today due to a family emergency. But we do have Professor Jean-Pascal van Ypersele from Belgium, and Professor Fu Jun from Peking University, and also Dr. Ma Jun from Peking University. And he has a number of responsibilities, and Professor He just gave an introduction. Dr. Ma Jun, can you turn on your video?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, now we are here. Okay. Thank you for joining the panel discussion. And our topic is about how to achieve the decarbonization in our planet of cities. And we have 3 panelists here, and we have 1 hour time. And so I will go around to ask questions, and hopefully through the structured question and answer, we could put some light into the current issues of climate change that we are so much concerned about. And let me first turn to Jean-Pascal. Jean-Pascal served as the advisor to the Belgian delegation to the COP26, and he just returned from Glasgow to Belgium and fresh out of the COP26. And Jean-Pascal has been a long time activist, I would say, or advocate for climate change management, and made a number of contributions in the global climate action and strategy and technical studies or so. So very much an insider in the international negotiation process. So I want to ask Jean-Pascal, what are your main takeaway from the COP26?
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. In Belgium, it's early morning. And thank you for the invitation and the organization of this important forum. I have 6 main remarks after coming back from COP26, which was the 25th COP I attended. I attended COP1 in '95 and almost all the other ones since. The first thing is that COP26 delivered a set of decisions that will help implement the Paris Agreement. And it's a step in the right direction. It is certainly much more than blah, 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 to use an expression recently used by Greta Thunberg. But clearly also it is not enough. Many criticisms have been made about the lack of ambition and etc. But I would like to look a little bit on the positive side as well, because it is true that it's not enough. But I see a number of positive elements. And the first one is that there is an even clearer recognition of the urgency of action. You know, the impacts of climate change here are now visible in every part of the world. There are droughts in Africa, floods in Canada. We had terrible floods in my home country, in Belgium, and also in Germany last July. There were terrible floods in China as well. There are floods at the moment in Canada. Agriculture is threatened in Madagascar. I mean, there are so many places in the world where the impacts of climate change have become visible that nobody anymore can deny that climate change is on its way and that we really need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, in particular CO2 and methane, in order to stabilize the climate and keep the planet inhabitable. A sign of this clear recognition of this situation is the way the latest IPCC report, the Working Group 1 contribution, which was published last August, and I'd like to remark that this was under the co-chairmanship of an eminent Chinese scientist, Pan Mao. The words, the language used to welcome the latest IPCC report in the Glasgow conclusions are very positive, and this has not always been the case at past COP meetings, you know, so it's significant. So that's the first element. The second element is that there was a clear recognition of the huge gap between the current plans, you know, those NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and what would be needed to protect climate. And there's a call to increase the level of ambition of those plans on an annual basis and not just every 5 years. And that's important because if we only revise those plans every 5 years, it doesn't give the dynamics that's really needed to raise the level of ambition. And that's when I say a level of ambition, it's true as well for mitigation, that is reduction of greenhouse gases, as for adaptation and finance. Third point, as I mentioned initially, the finalization of the rules to implement the Paris Agreement, particularly, but not only in relation to the carbon markets, and those rules largely, even if they could still be improved, but largely respect the rules of environmental integrity, which is very important because the atmosphere only knows you know, real emissions. It doesn't know, it doesn't understand accounting tricks like double counting and that kind of things. The fourth element is that there is a clear call to reduce the use of coal and also to reduce and progressively eliminate subsidies to fossil fuels. The language used is inefficient subsidies to fossil fuels, but what matters is to reduce subsidies to fossil fuels, maybe starting with those which are inefficient, but it's as Professor Spence mentioned earlier, it's a very important signal because as long as fossil fuels are subsidized, well, they're easier to use, and it goes against the movement to cut severely on their usage and therefore cut CO2 emissions. A fifth element is that there was a beginning of a response, and it's a step in the right direction, I think, to the demands of vulnerable countries, particularly the most vulnerable countries, that the damage they suffer as a result of climate disruption be compensated by the countries most responsible for it. You know, this issue of loss and damage has long been on the agenda of the climate negotiations. Developed countries have long resisted to the mention of this concept, and here for the first time there's a beginning of a step the direction of recognizing that there are losses and damage happening in many countries, particularly the most vulnerable, and that this issue needs to be addressed. And then the fifth elements I'd like to recognize is the promises made, and I know many promises have been made in the past and have not been fulfilled. So I really hope that these promises will be more fulfilled than the preceding one, but I think the pressure for that is now higher. The promises to increase the budgets devoted to financing climate action by developing countries, you know, that promise made 13 years ago in Copenhagen, 12 years ago in Copenhagen in 2009, to raise $100 billion per year from developed countries for developing countries, both for mitigation and adaptation. And that promise has not yet been fulfilled, but at least now there is the beginning of a plan to finally meet that promise. And there is also a recognition that the share of that money needs to be devoted to adaptation, which is needed in any case, because some part of climate change has become, unfortunately, unavoidable. The share of those funds devoted to adaptation needs to increase, and ideally should be 50% for adaptation, 50% for mitigation. So these 6 elements I think are the most positive elements coming out of Glasgow, even though as I say after almost every COP, there was progress indeed, but the progress is way too slow and way too little to really be at the level of what's needed to address this climate change crisis.
Okay, well, thank you very much for giving us your opinion about the achievement and the shortfall of COP26. Now, it's interesting that when Mike made the keynote speech and he talked about an investment need for climate change, and that's $3 trillion a year is needed for the global actions. And here, Jean-Pascal, you talk about also the big gap, the huge gap of financing in climate change actions in developing countries. And I know in the recent years, the green finance has been growing rapidly. So let me turn to Dr. Ma Jun. He is the co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group for a few years now, and helped develop the G20 Green Finance Initiative. And so my question is that when you work on the green finance globally, and what is your view about the current landscape of green finance and the trend over the last few years, and how you see the role of green finance in the near future?
Thank you very much, Professor Liu. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks again for the invitation. Now, let me start with the question of how much money we need to finance carbon neutrality and net zero. That's a topic being discussed by Professor Spence and other speakers already. Then I come down to how to meet the demand, whether we need a lot of public or private sector financing, and then the topic of how to structure a green accessible financial system. Both I'll touch upon the China experience and some of the global negotiations, especially G20, which is a fairly complex process because you have to reach consensus among 20 members with very diverse economic situations. Now, starting with demand, I think Professor Spence is citing a fairly small number, a few $1 trillion per year for carbon neutrality globally. In fact, what we did in China just about 2 months ago, as published by the Green Finance Committee as I chair, is that in China, we need about $2 trillion per year for green investment in the coming 30 years. That's a big number already. So that's about 2/3 of Professor Spence's number for the global demand. Of course, there are a lot of a number issues. For example, our scope is not only carbon neutrality, meaning we have both decarbonization projects there, but also environmental projects that help reduce air pollution, water pollution, land contamination, and we have biodiversity related projects as well. That's a larger sort of a scope or definition of green. But indeed, decarbonization is a big part of that. According to the latest figures coming from the central bank, around 2/3 of the green investments in China are related to carbon related actions. Now, I think if we sort of calculate the global equivalent of total demand for green investment, that's going to be many more trillions. I don't know whether it's a 7 trillion or 10 trillion, but if we estimate the potential demand coming out of all emerging markets, I think it's going to be closer to $10 trillion per year. Certainly, this results in a huge financing gap because currently the available financing for them, whether coming from the public sector or private sector, is much, much lower than the required amount of financing. So that brings the second topic of the composition of supply of financing for carbon neutrality and other green projects. In China, as early as in 2014, when I began to lead the study group within the central bank on establishing a green financial system, we estimated that in China, 90% of the green financing needs to be coming from the private sector. And the government, including the central government and local fiscal authorities, can only meet 10% of that demand. So that gives a huge importance to the financial industry, including banks, asset managers, insurance companies, capital markets, to mobilize the private sector money to participate in green activities. And that translates into the question of how to do this. Our Chinese experience is that we took a top-down approach by designing what we call green financial system. And that system includes the 4 pillars. Number one, we need to have a clearly defined scope of green investments. That's what we call taxonomy. So as of now, we have 3 sets of taxonomy. One is for green lending, one for green bonds, and one for green projects, each coming from different ministries. And the second pillar is the disclosure requirements, because for green projects, the main difference between green and the other projects is that they need to have environmental benefits, which mean that they either reduce pollution or reduce carbon or protect biodiversity or do some other good things against the SDGs. But if you are doing these good things, you need to measure them and report them. You need to tell the market, for example, how many tons of CO2 you're reducing by making this investment and how many tons of reduction in SO2 or NOx you're achieving. And the third element is the suite of products, because the real economy is very complex. It's quite different kind of financing. Some are suitable for green loans, some suitable for green bonds, which can be longer dated. Some requires capital that can absorb some risks like PE and VC, and some probably just need an insurance product to protect them against certain risks arising from the operation. That's why we need a suite of products ranging from green loans, green bonds, to green insurance, to ESG products, to ABS and ETF and REITs and all that. After 5 or 6 years efforts in China, we now have the largest green lending market in the world with outstanding green loans at 15 trillion RMB. And we now have a second largest green bond market. In the past 5.5 years, we issued 1.6 trillion RMB worth of green loans. And we now have 700 green funds, largely in the equity space, but still not enough. Far from the demand coming out of the carbon neutrality goal. And that's why additional efforts are needed to boost the supply of green financing. And the fourth element is what I call incentives, because many of the green projects may not be initially very profitable. They do have environmental benefits. In the longer term, they will become profitable because cost is coming down, technology is improving. But in the next few years, they may not be in that position. And that's why the government wants to help them by, in the China case, giving subsidies for interest payments, guarantees. And in the case of our central bank, we offered very recently the decarbonization facility, which is a facility that central banks, through which a central bank provides cheap financing through commercial banks to the low carbon projects. I think many other countries are doing similar things, but in different ways. In other countries, they call green QE. And we actually in China have done the green QE already. We're not calling this green QE. Now, the future of green financial system requires a lot of modification, especially in light of the carbon neutrality pledge made by China. A couple of directions that we are working towards. One is we are revising our green finance taxonomies, making sure that these projects are consistent with carbon neutrality. And secondly, we are requiring corporates and financial firms to report carbon-related information. Before, they tend to report environmental, pollution-related information or benefits, but now they need to report the carbon intensity of the projects they're financing and show the regulators and the market how much reduction they can achieve in carbon intensity for the projects they finance. And also the products need to be innovative to encourage more carbon reduction efforts. Just one example, that's carbon footprint related loans, bonds, and insurance products. All these things are now popping up. The interest rate of this loan or this bond is tied to the decarbonization efforts or performance of the company. If the company can reduce carbon more effectively than expected, then it can get lower funding costs from the bank or from the bond market. And such design of the instruments can encourage the users of the money to be more aggressive, innovative, and effective in lowering the carbon emission. And of course, there are many more incentives need to be in place, including the carbon pricing mechanism and possibly a carbon taxation for smaller companies in China. And the central bank, as I said, just came up with this decarbonization facility, and fiscal authority need to consider more tax and expenditure-related incentive for low carbon activities. Now, coming to the international side, let me emphasize the point that decarbonization.
Yeah. Dr. Ma, can you talk about the international green finance a bit later? Because that's exactly my next question to you after the first round, okay? Yeah, and
sure,
you gave a lot of information already, and we received questions specifically to you, but we can wait a little bit to get back to you.
No problem.
Jean-Pascal, you raised your hand, and do you have an urgent question now, or you can wait a little bit after we? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's a clarification question to Professor Jun. I wondered if in the estimates of 2 trillion per year that you gave for China to get to net zero, you were able to distinguish the investment that would be needed specifically to make the investment, the infrastructure, the investment, etc., green and going to net zero, and those investments.
It's frozen. We cannot
which
hear.
would be needed in any case, because I mean, I'm not an economic country. You cannot hear? Do you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear now. No, we cannot hear. It seems the system.
Sorry. In any case, you need investment. So let me switch my video. Then maybe you.
Good idea.
You hear me better if I switch my camera out? Yes. Sorry for this. So my question is, a given country, any country, is always making investment to renew and improve its infrastructure and also to develop in a general sense. When you say 2 trillion per year, is that the specific addition that is needed per year to make those investments green and going to net zero, or is that the total of those investments? Because that's probably an interesting data.
Yeah, good question. Dr. Ma, can we hold a little bit?
Sure.
I saved the question for you. And let me first turn to Professor Fu. And Dr. Ma talked a bit about China, specifically about the green finance. Professor Fu and his team have worked on the climate change, climate mitigation and adaptation in China for the last few years. I know his team has identified a number of major challenges in climate change management in China. And I want to ask Professor Fu to highlight the main challenges for China in terms of decarbonization. And now we have the policy to get to carbon neutrality by the year 2060. It would be a major challenge for all of us. And actually, the next question relating to this is that, and I want Professor Fu to discuss a bit whether these challenges are unique to China or fairly common across the developing countries. Unmute, we can't hear. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. for having me here, and also to see my old friends here. Challenge China, unique or not? My short answer is yes and no. What's unique about China is if we are still in the midst of urbanization and industrialization, relative to advanced economies, not unique compared to countries that are continuing to continue on their road to higher income countries. That now, urbanization so far is roughly 60%, or you can say, if I compare that with the advanced economies, roughly 80%, probably won't be there. We heard from our experts this morning, we need to about 30% of population that will have staying rural areas for food safety. So it's probably safe to say it's a 75 to 80%, that range. Consider that part. This is not unique. Now, the unique part is when we look at the energy structure in China. At the moment, 15 non-fossil, 85% fossil. And the bulk of that is coal. And this is very unique. So we have to work very hard over a long period of time to gradually phase in non-fossil fuels and phase out fossil fuels. We have a large population, but looking forward, it seems that will stabilize. This is both unique and not unique. We can counter the numbers. Now, the way we organize ourselves to address those questions can be simplified as one is MBA, not the Basketball Association, market-based approach, sort of. And PPA, public policy approach. I will say a bit of that. And CCUS sort of representing the technology frontier. It's a very complicated technology, but as a derivative of technology, we can talk about a range of technologies that we're looking into developing. Then MBS, market-based solutions. as a branch out of an MBA market-based solutions, I was also would say is ETF trading system. And the further derivative of that, of course, is green finance. So basically, you have this structure that China is doing, is learning knowledge to recalibrate the precision of the knowledge we have. But given now that this is a unique part of the Chinese system, we have a very sophisticated bureaucracy. Once we have a consensus, it probably would be easier, relatively easier, for us to roll out plans and to start actions. So this is a unique part of China. In terms of PPA, now I would say, we have been using the word carbon equity, carbon neutrality. My observation is that now we haven't had a lot of political scientists to see those. We have a lot of engineers here in China, and this panel we have economists, political science, or political economy, so a mix of those. You see the difference, yes, sir? So if for me to have a political science cut into carbon equity and a carbon neutrality, I think it's very important because this is a subtle but deep implication of the political will that Chinese leadership has reached. Carbon equity means particular justice, sort of common, differentiated. Equity sort of you have both. Particular justice. When you're talking about carbon neutrality, it's general justice. But in the case of China, because we have to be realistic, after all, we are in the midst of urbanization and industrialization. We need to reach that framework for general justice with a discount, if you may, or allowances, if you may, of 10 additional years. Fair under the circumstances. The Indians, if they follow the same framework of moving from a carbon equity, particular justice, to general justice. After all, we are talking about future of a shared future of mankind. You know, you have to have some sort of a general justice, allowances of 20 years. Then other countries probably lie in the middle of somewhere. This is so important, and the leadership has arrived at a consensus. You see, this is very important for China, given the Chinese system. We promised to peak prior to 2030. Then we have to phase down the fossil part of our structure. So to put a long story short, urbanization and industrialization, it's normal in terms of stage of development. Uniqueness, now in terms of MBA, PPA, CCUS, MBC, these are sort of things that many countries are doing, but Chinese PPA, public policy approach, is unique, particularly when you look at its organization, bureaucratic structure. And now the government has come up with the sort of the formula. It's called 1+N. Given the vast regional differences here in China, we need to have a central authority to design, but the central authority will be sensitive to regional differences. Regional difference, also industrial structure differences. An example of them being sensitive to the regional differences is that when you see sort of pilot project of ETS, we started with 7 pilots plus 1, so it's 8. And the information that we have gotten from those pilots that indeed we have variations. If we just impose one more, that probably run the risk of making regions richer, poor regions poor. So we have to somehow to have a phasing and a phase out process to the 2 general objectives. One is prior to 2030 and to reach neutrality 26. I have to stop here and ready to answer additional questions.
Thank you very much. And I think your views is quite provocative. And I understand Mike wrote about climate justice, fairness. So even back 12 years ago when he wrote the report for the World Bank. Mike, do you have any reaction to Professor Fu's the idea about general justice and specific justice.
Yeah, I agree with. Well, I always agree with Fu Jun, but in this case, I actually really do. You know, this is just. I tried to advert to it briefly. I mean, it's just terribly important sort of concept. I might not put it in exactly the same terms, so I'll learn how to use this terminology. But I think it's absolutely right. We can't get there if we can't, you know, make the kind of mental adjustments for, you know, where countries are in their development cycle, and make, you know. Then the trick is, of course, it's quite easy to say that, but if Jean-Pascal gives us a sort of intertemporal carbon budget, you know, and now we've got to divvy it up, you know, amongst the various countries in the world, then, you know, actually doing that and coming to an agreement on it that everybody agrees is sort of somehow fair, even if we're all going to be hurting a little bit. I guess that's what these COP26, you know, events are really kind of in part all about. But I agree with Fu Jun. The core of this is various kinds of justice.
Okay, thank you. Jean-Pascal, I know you are waiting for the answer from Dr. Ma, but before I get to Dr. Ma to answer your question about the $2 trillion US investment in China, and I would ask you a specific question. And you just highlight your 6 takeaways from COP26. And I know you are quite critical about the outcome of the COP26 because it falls short of your expectation or the expectation of many people. Now, looking forward for the next, let's say, 5 years, what kind of specific recommendation you will have about the global actions to get to the point that we are close to the expectation? And you highlight a huge gap in terms of commitment and also the investment. So if you take the need to for the next few years, what specific or concrete actions you would recommend?
Well, you know, I wish I had a magical wand, you know, to solve the world's problem, but I don't, and I don't have that capacity and that, unfortunately. But okay, there's so many so many avenues, so many ways. There isn't a single one difficulty with the climate change issue, and it's probably the same for biodiversity and nature protection, is that there isn't a single tool, a single policy that will solve everything. Now, maybe I will, with your permission, I'll switch my camera off because I see that my internet connection is maybe not strong enough, so you'll hear better.
We cannot hear.
Everything dealing with, I'm sorry about that. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, so I'm really sorry about that. Everything that is dealing with the taxonomy and the qualification of what is green and not green, etc., is very important. It's actually a discussion taking place in the European Union as well, as I'm sure you are aware. That's one point. So I'd like to really emphasize the importance of what Professor Ma Jun and Professor Fu Jun said earlier. The other point, the second and last point I'd like to make at this stage is I strongly believe that a better recognition of the importance of synergies between the different sustainable development goals. Well, you don't see my camera now, but even on the picture you have of me, you see that I almost always have the pin of the logo of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and the climate action is number 13, but as you know, the first one is eradicating poverty, the second eliminating hunger, etc. And I think there isn't enough recognition that solving each of those problems would actually be easier if we would, cut the walls between the different silos in which too often those goals are placed. And this is, I'd like maybe to point out that 2 years ago, we published, and I was a member of that 15 member group of authors, a report on the Global Sustainable Development, the Global Sustainable Development Report 2019, which was asked by the UN Secretary General. And we pleaded very strongly in that report, which you can easily find online on the UN website, for a better recognition of those synergies and the immense possibilities that would be obtained if we would be cutting the walls between all those silos. I mean, the action to protect climate, to protect biodiversity, to eradicate poverty, to eradicate hunger would be significantly cheaper and easier, even though everything is difficult, if the whole of the Agenda 2030 was considered together.
Thank you. And now let's turn to Dr. Ma Jun. I think you wait for some time, and please answer the question of Jean-Pascal, and then I would like you to highlight your view on the international green finance, since you serve as the co-chair for the G20 Green Finance Working Group. In particular, I think our audience would like to hear more about green finance in the emerging market.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Let me start by answering Jean-Pascal's question of what's inside this 2 trillion and how we actually define this. I mentioned only one difference between our definition and some other estimates definition. That's the scope of the industry that we cover. In fact, what we cover is 211 green sectors that's defined by the Chinese NDRC. It's a very long list of things, including, it's actually a 60-page long document with 211 categories. Now, many of these are decarbonization, some of these are environmental, others biodiversity, and so on, and circular economy. That's why our scope is bigger than the pure decarbonization efforts. The second difference is that we include both fixed investment and working capital requirement. I know some other estimates, especially coming from energy specialists, they focused only on equipment investment without considering the need to maintain the equipment, for the many years to come. And that's the working capital aspects, which is recurring, that we included as well in our estimation. And the third difference, which is, I think, exactly what Jean-Pascal is asking, is whether our definition refers to the additional cost associated with greening a particular project. My answer is no, because we estimate the number on behalf of the financial industries. For example, a bank, they want to have a projection of what's needed for me to finance in the coming 5-10 years. And they need to provide the total funding for the entire project rather than the green bits of the projects. Now, this especially is true for projects in the building sector and transportation sector. I know the greener parts is actually a small percentage of a building or a infrastructure project. But we need to take into account the entire thing in order for the financial institutions to plan, for their budgeting, and for the corporates to decide how much they want to borrow or to issue bonds in the bond market. But in other sectors, such as energy sector, manufacturing sector, our concept tend to be closer to the additional cost concept, because in these sectors, there are many occasions where you can actually buy a particular equipment, and that equipment is almost entirely for energy saving or for switching towards cleaner energy purposes. So the answer is that our definition is different, and it differs more in the building and transportation industries than in the energy and the manufacturing sector. That's Professor Spence. You muted yourself.
I'll just say this quickly. You know more about this than I do, but if you scale up with some version of what you're talking about in China, as you said, to the global level, you get in the 7-8 trillion range. You have, the global GDP.
We have your version of the Chinese number. Using your definition, I think the IPCC or the energy specialist definition, they came up with a number that's 1/3 of my number for China.
No, I understand that, but let me just stick with your numbers. The global GDP is just over $80 trillion. So if you scale up your number for a kind of global economy, you're talking about 10% of the global GDP.
Yeah, it's close to.
It doesn't sound like we can.
Yeah, it makes sense
to me like we can pull that off, to put it bluntly.
It makes sense for our actual delivery. Just tell you that in the Chinese banking system, the outstanding loans, 10% of outstanding loans are green loans already, according to our classification. And the banks, they finance probably 85% of the total Chinese economic activities.
10% of loans is one thing, and 10% of the GDP is another, right?
Well, the GDP requires financing, and the majority of financing coming from the loans. That's why I'm sort of making this analogy as, according to our definition, 10% of the GDP needs to be what we define as green activities.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, clear.
Thank you.
Just Jean-Pascal?
Yeah, Jean-Pascal?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to interrupt, but yeah. Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Jun, for your answer. Still, I recognize that the banks need to know what the total amount to be financed is, but I think there would be much value in providing both numbers. Because when you quote such a number, $2 trillion or $8 trillion for the world or whatever, it might be perceived as impossible to assemble, and I think it would be useful to actually give the two numbers. The total, but also the increment that is really needed to make those investments green or going to net zero or whatever, because it would maybe increase the understanding that this is achievable. Because if only the first number is given without the explanation that this is a total number of which, in any case, a large proportion probably would have been needed, whatever the development path. It's different. So
we have both numbers in our report. Yeah, okay. in our report we have a few sets of numbers, including some using your definition, and these numbers roughly is 1/3 of our number. So you can roughly see that sort of incremental cost of greening the operation is probably 1/3 of the cost we, namely the banks, carry about. Now, let me just come to the question of international collaboration in the green sustainable finance space. As you probably heard that we launched the G20 Green Finance Study Group in 2016 when China was the presidency. And I had the honor to co-chair this group together with a colleague from UK between 2016 and 2018. And this year is quite different. We are now co-chairing this with the US. So I myself, once again, is representing China and now working with a US Treasury colleague to co-chair what we call now the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And this working group just came up with a major document. It's called the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which will guide the G20 work in this space for the coming few years. And we touched upon quite a few, what we believe as a very important issue that requires global coordination, including taxonomy, disclosure requirements, and framework for transition finance. There are many more issues. We actually have 19 actions in the roadmap, but let me just highlight these three. On the taxonomy side, back 5 years ago, we were having the problem of many countries and markets having no taxonomy. So there was no definition and everybody saying we are doing green stuff. But now we are facing the problem of having too many taxonomies. I've been hearing that there are 200 taxonomies around the world. Some are developed by authorities like the Chinese ministries and also the European legislature. But others are by NGOs, by industrial associations, by banks and asset managers. This is equivalent to like 200 languages being spoken in the same community, which causes a lot of confusions and reinforcing the market segmentation, increasing transaction cost, and potentially raising the probability of greenwashing. That's why we need to tackle that issue by making efforts to improve comparability, interoperability, and consistency of taxonomies in the sustainable finance space. That's one major issue which is raised in this year's G20 roadmap, and some specific actions are being proposed. Just to give you one example of the type of actions that may be able to help, that's between China and Europe. Back 1 year ago, China and Europe co-chaired the IPSF working group on taxonomy with the aim of producing a common taxonomy that's recognized both by China and Europe. And after 16 months of work, this working group has produced a common ground taxonomy, which was released just a couple of weeks ago during the COP. And this set of taxonomy is actually the overlapping portion of the Chinese and the European version. And just give you one example of how we can use it. A Chinese green bond issuer can use this common ground taxonomy to issue green bonds in Europe, and European issuers can choose to use this taxonomy to issue green bonds in China without being verified twice. So that's a concrete example of how we can reduce transaction costs and facilitate cross-border green capital flows. The second key issue that G20 addressed this year is improving consistency of sustainability-related reporting. Again, there are many reporting standards, frameworks, guidelines on climate-related, environmental-related, biodiversity-related information, and they become very confusing. Some are requiring certain information, some are requiring other information, some are mandatory, some are voluntary, and the world needs a consistent set of standards for reporting so that fund managers, for example, managing an international portfolio can compare the ESG performance of their assets across different markets. And this year, the major achievement in the G20 is to reach a consensus to support the launch of ISSB. That's the International Sustainability Standard Board, which will be tasked to develop this internationally consistent set of reporting standards. And I think it will be developing the first set of baseline standards within 1 year. Sometime by November next year, we will see the first initially climate-focused reporting standards coming out as a basis for different countries reporting domestic reporting standards. The third issue, which required global coordination, and I think now being effectively organized by the G20, is to develop a framework for transition finance. Historically, the green sustainable finance focused on what we call pure green projects, but there's so many economic activities which are still high carbon in nature, and they need money to transform themselves into low carbon and eventually zero carbon activities. And that part of the economy, I think, represents 90% of GDP, especially emerging market economies. And we cannot leave them alone in terms of financing. And that's why a framework for financing such transition is needed, which requires many elements, including proper taxonomy for transition activities, proper disclosure standards for describing the dynamic process of transition, and appropriate financial instruments as well as incentives for supporting such activities. Back to you, Professor Liu.
Okay, thank you very much. A very specific answer to my question. And now let me turn to Fu Jun again. And you talk about the climate change actions in China fairly philosophically, but I want to ask a more specific question. And China is now running to the running to the carbon neutrality by year 2060. And your team has done extensive study on climate mitigation and adaptation. And I want to know from you, I think our audience also want to know from you about a specific roadmap to achieve the carbon neutrality for the next few decades. This might be the output of your new book, which is going to be launched later.
Well, we have done some projection, and as I indicated earlier, we have a framework that include MBA market-based approach, EPA public policy approach, CCUS, CCS, and nature-based solutions. And to put the projection simply, looking forward, 10 years down the road, we'll peak at 1.14 or 3 billion tons of CO. And from then on, we do all kinds of different combinations of the things I talked about, MBA, PPA, CCUS, MBC. Now, the best scenario is sort of we look at the compound effects of all those. Early, we heard reports sort of, well, for China to achieve that, it would be better for China to flip the energy structure from the current status of 15 non-fossil, 85 fossil to 15 non-fossil and 85 non-fossil. But for the best scenario that we projected, given all we know, is that we cannot do that. So it's the non-fossil will remain above 20%. That in a way probably gives a larger space for CCS or CCUS. It's better you use the utilization part of technology. Then that technology is it's an active technology. So this is what we projected, but of course we ended with a caveat. We face a lot of uncertainties. The process, well, we do simulation, and we pointed out simulation is very different from emulation. You know, in English, we sort of easy to say that simulation is linear. You project forward, given different scenarios. For instance, when we talk about, it's very interesting to hear people debate about the numbers. Mike come up with the 3T, Margin came up with the 8T. But in that case, we would sort of say, well, we look both cases and we put that into the model and see, and we probably will look at somewhere in between. But for us to project forward, we make a caveat saying simulation is very different from emulation. What actually happened in reality is emulation. Human beings are very smart. They were learning the process, and we're open-minded about the technologies coming in the horizon. There may be shocks, positive and negative. And with the three things, I also am very happy to hear Jean-Pascal was saying we have to be systematic. I would also synergistic. Well, the way we do that is we have to be systematic, synergistic, and holistic. So we look at policy, technology, market coming together, and there we probably have a good hope to reach carbon neutrality in the case of China by 2060. Of course, people here also talk about international cooperation. This is so important because the world system is such that at the end of the day, it's anarchy. We do not have a central government globally. And that is why when we send out a draft for reviews, they also send a draft to political scientists. Those with international relations have a very strong sense that at the end of the day, it's an anarchy. Now, how the big power can come together politically to cap the system, then the secondary market is trading. So I would encourage people to read our books and to see the different scenarios we have forward. We're optimistic as long as we remember the three words that I used: systematic, synergistic, and holistic: policy, technology, and the markets.
Thank you. We have 10 more minutes to go, and we receive questions from our audiences. And I also have a question for Mike, but I will save it. And then by the last 3 minutes, I will ask you one very short question. So let me first start from the first question from the audience. And it says that the global energy consumption structure is determined by the use of fossil fuel. Now, how to speed up the transformation of energy consumption structure? I know Jean-Pascal is a leading advocate of phasing out the fossil fuel around the world. Can you answer this question?
Well, you know, I'm not an advocate of eliminating fossil fuel. I'm an advocate for keeping the inhabitability of the planet for all that is living on its surface, because it's the only inhabitable planet in the solar system. But if we want, as a climate scientist, I know that if we want to keep the planet inhabitable, we actually need to stop the increase in thickness of the thermal insulation layer we are installing around the planet. And therefore, yes, we need to phase out or phase down, the language used in Glasgow, the usage of fossil fuel as quickly as possible. And you know, the reason we are thickening that layer of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is that we consider the atmosphere as a free dustbin. And you know, a big problem with CO2 and methane and others is that they are invisible. So contrary to domestic waste or industrial waste, we don't see the CO2 that we emit. I mean, in Belgium, we emit of the order of 10 tons of CO2 per year, that's and per person. So that's approximately a little less than 1 ton per month. It's a lot, but we don't see it. And we just put it in the atmosphere, which we consider a free dustbin. So really, if we can change the price of using that dustbin, things will change, and things are changing. And this is what
you may have to turn off your video so that we can hear your voice.
Why economic instruments are so important. When there is a price on using the atmosphere as a dustbin, and which can be done by a number of economic instruments, whether it's a carbon tax or a carbon market or whatever, then everybody, all economic actors, whether a large industry or citizens, will think more before just using the atmosphere as a free dustbin. So I think one very important key, it's not the only one, but a very important key is trying to put progressively a price on carbon put in the atmosphere.
Thank you. Fu Jun, one question for you. What is your view about the regional coordination within China to achieve the carbon neutrality? Because in China, I mean, the regional disparity is very significant.
Well, we have a central government to coordinate. And as I said, we have a 1+N approach. Central government has there to sort of the overarching approach. And then with public policy, with market instruments, and now the region, the different regions will have to figure out what's the best, both short and long term, reach the overall objective that I have. China is unique in the sense that if we look at its fiscal system, that in a way will give you a mirror of probably what China will do even when it comes to decarbonization. The central government will serve as a grandfather. It will collect tax, then do transfer. After all, we have rich regions and poor regions. And for based on my is China says to the regional divergence. You look at and now we have a unified national market, but it's a phased process. Even when we look at the regional unified national carbon trading system, we start with the power sector first. Well, the three big ones, the power, it will take, it takes about 45% of emissions. And the steel, 15, cement, anywhere between 12, probably around 12. And the three big ones have the bulk of that. But given the different industrial structure across different regions, instead of imposing one model, what I see is a gradual rolling out of the system. And the system eventually will have to move in the direction, in the hope that we have a case of convergence between what's what transpiring here in China, and also what is transpiring in EU, and also what's transpiring in the United States, the big ones. We're looking at the three big ones. So this is very important. But there has to be a phase-out approach. People also mention the sense of urgency, you know. Well, I feel a very strong sense of urgency. My concern is that the sense is too strong. We run the risk of using fiat too much, not market approach, such that we end up with campaign style. This probably is not good. We must have the political determination. And between fiat and the market, we need to strike a very good balance. At the end of the day, it's market that will work and that will take account of emissions. This is sort of the message that we will send out by the book published.
Thank you. And Marjin, you got a few questions, but I don't think we have the time to answer all questions. And let me just go for the first two. And now in the industry that your green finance is going to support, you have the traditional industries, you have the new green industries. So of course the green finance would have the priority to go to the new green finance, but then the traditional industries may not be very happy about it because the crowding out of the financing in resources. And how do you balance the interests of the traditional industries and the new industries in terms of financing? That's the first question. And the second question is that what are the main barriers to promote the green buildings in China? Unmute.
On the first question, the current green financial system, or in other countries called sustainable financial system, do accommodate some activities that's transforming their operation towards greener or decarbonization, but not enough. If you look at our taxonomy in the more recent version of the 211 categories of activities, there are certain activities which are projects that can be used by traditional industries. For example, you can basically buy these equipments for steel, cement, petrochemical, and enhance energy efficiency, or replace certain raw materials with less carbon intensive ones. So these projects are available there, and they are being supported by green finance. But my point is that that's not enough. There are many more transition activities which are not yet included in the current green and the sustainable finance taxonomy. They need to be included. And also, entity-based transformation are not accommodated in the current green financial system. By entity-based, I mean a whole company which has done a lot of different things, some green, some brown, some polluting, some non-polluting. And if this company is determined to transform itself into a renewable company with much greener activities, can the company get financing as a package so that they can undertake these initiatives? Currently, that kind of arrangement is not allowed under the existing green financial system. That's why I'm saying we need to modify the taxonomy's disclosure requirements instruments so that whether it's project-based transition activities or company-based transition activities, they should be all accommodated, but with a very strong caveat that we should guard against transition wash. We previously heard about the green wash. There were a lot of attempts to pretend to be green, but in the future, there certainly will be attempt to pretend to be transitioning, but may not be truly transitioning. That's something we need to design a system to prevent.
Okay.
The second question, sorry, on green building. There are many problems in financing green buildings, but one obvious problem is that the lack of information on the building's green information. For example, each building, what's the green standard it met at the design stage? What do the green standards have achieved when they actually operate? Such information is very dynamic, and they can often be incorrect or misleading or altered by market participants. And that's why we need to build a information database that's accurate, that can be used by financial institutions so they can target the truly green buildings to provide low-cost financing.
Thank you. And Mike, now I swing back to you, and this is my question. Nowadays, we have an international carbon trade market and also regional carbon trade market like the EU, and national carbon trade market like the one in China. And of course, we consider the integration of a carbon trade market and just one single market in the world may be the most efficient. Do you have any opinion about the integration of the carbon trade market around the world?
But it's a very good question. I mean, I guess the opinion is it's going to take some time. You can't integrate. I mean, let's suppose carbon trading markets spread. They're still going to reflect local conditions, right? And and circumstances. And so I don't think you can just glue them together. I mean, if you just conduct the thought experiment, take a developed country and a relatively, say, low middle income country, and so where the price of carbon is rather different, and you stick them together, you know, the price of carbon is going to sort of go shooting up in one place and down in another, and it's, you know, and it would happen very suddenly if you integrated them. So my guess is, I mean, I don't know how to put this precisely, but basically we're going to have to wait until we get some degree of convergence before we integrate these markets. Otherwise, I think it'll be A, disruptive, and B, resisted.
Thank you. Well, now our time is up, and let me ask the final question to all of you. So you may just use a few seconds or less than 1 minute to answer my short question. And we are working hard to reach the global objective of controlling the global temperature increase to 1.5 degree. And how confident are you that we can achieve this objective in the next few decades? Okay. Jean-Pascal, you go first.
Okay, I go first. You know, if you read the IPCC reports, the number of technologies, the number of policies, whether public or policies that can be implemented at industry level, at company level, is so huge that my conclusion is that the solutions are there. What is really lacking up to now is enough political will at all levels, in all countries on the average, to implement what it is possible to implement. So I am quite optimistic, actually. If we really want it, we can. And I think it's possible. Also, we have to realize that the target of staying below 1.5 is to stay below 1.5 as sometimes described in 2100. That's wrong. It's to stay below 1.5 degrees C warming, period. So that means a bit above for some time, by middle of this century, for example, and it's possible that we might be a little bit above 1.5. It is still very important to keep that target and to try to, you know, after an overshoot, to bring back the temperature below 1.5, actually as low as possible. And I think it's possible if we really want it.
Thank you very much. Martin.
I think we pretty much know how to get in terms of achieving carbon neutrality, let's say for OECD countries by 2050, for China by 2060, by 2070 for India. A lot more efforts than we currently have. We need a lot more policy efforts, a lot more technology to be invented and refined, and a lot more financing that's available. I think in these three areas, we only have half of them ready. And the other half needs to be mobilized with much stronger efforts, including, you know, through experts sitting around the table.
Thank you. Fu Jun?
Well, I would say hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And we say, well, we need this high level of investment. To me, it's a signal of preparing for the worst. And if you do that, that will make the job easier. At the end of the day, we think human beings are smart, and this is the problem we created, and we'll figure out ways to solve the problem. But the precondition is systematic, synergistic, holistic, international coordination.
Thank you. Mike?
I agree with everybody. Fu Jun said something earlier, which is right, which is once you reach a consensus on direction in China, you're pretty sure something's going to happen. And that's not true necessarily in the rest of the world. So Jean-Pascal highlighted the importance of political will. And I agree with Ma Jun too. I think we mostly there's a very good report from the International Energy Agency saying how much of it do we actually know how to do, and what fraction do we still have to invent. And I'm sure that that Fujin's book will help illuminate this as well. But I guess I'm sort of cautiously optimistic. But if I had to say where I think the big doubt is, or doubts, their political will in places like where I'm a citizen, where we're suffering from political and social polarization and don't really necessarily always have long time horizons in the way policy is put together. So, and then, you know, international cooperation is at least, you know, kind of a question mark at this point. So I'm hopeful, but I think we should follow Fujin's lead and plan for the worst as well.
Thank you very much. I think that this is a great panel discussion. At least I feel a bit more optimistic and hopeful. And I also hope our audience come away with a bit more optimism and more hope about our future planet of cities. Thank you very much. I turn this back to Professor He.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We do have a very fruitful discussion, and also I learned a lot